How does it happen that societies change their fundamental values and beliefs? There are only two ways, either from the outside, by being conquered and having different values and fundamental beliefs forcibly imposed upon them, or from the inside, by a slow but steady weakening commitment to their own professed values. That, and not conquest, was what happened to the pre-modern West. In the previous video, we spoke about how pre-modern, educated, and privileged Western Europeans, all of them devout Christians, never stopped studying the books of pagan Greek and Roman writers, poets, and philosophers, and that this preoccupation was one of the factors that ultimately led to the decline of medieval Christendom and the creation of modern Western society. But what was so disruptive of medieval society about the texts they were so keen on studying? And how did a movement confined to a tiny group of bookworms have such an outsized effect on the entire society around them? Welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition creates the human condition. By the way, if you haven't yet watched the previous video, I suggest that before you continue, click on the link in the description below to watch it, as it explains the background for what comes next here. Around the turn of the 15th century, as the 1300s were turning into the 1400s, a movement began to gain strength among a few educated men, and they were all men, whom later historians called Renaissance humanists. At first, mostly in Italy, men who were obsessed with books that were written more than 1500 years before their time, in languages that were no longer even spoken in Western Europe, and who rejected the scholastic curriculum of the universities in which many of them had studied. What was scholasticism? Combined classical philosophy, mainly Greek but also in its Roman versions, with the new Christian religion. Season with a variety of flavorings from Jewish and Islamic intellectual heritages, stir and simmer for 1300 years or more until done. In other words, scholasticism was a program that sought to reconcile Christian theology with classical philosophy, especially that of Aristotle, primarily by attempting to establish the truth of Christianity by rational philosophical arguments. Why did classical philosophy and Christianity need to be reconciled? Because Aristotle had denied two fundamental Christian teachings. He taught that matter had always existed, and that God had created the universe out of this pre-existing matter, not ex nihilo, from nothing, as stated in the Bible. He also taught that the human soul was not immortal, but died with the body, so there was no afterlife, no heaven, no hell. Also, some church fathers had rejected philosophy altogether, and indeed any knowledge that was not based on the Christian revelation. The Apostle Paul had written, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." The 2nd century church father Tertullian had written that all curiosity is at an end after Jesus, all research after the gospel. Let us have faith and wish for nothing more. A plague on Aristotle, he added, and asked, what has Jerusalem to do with Athens, the church with Plato's academy, the Christian with the heretic? But Christian scholars and theologians, most notably the 11th century St. Thomas Aquinas, had not done this. They had not rejected pagan philosophy. Neither had the Renaissance humanists, presumably devout Christians as well. Why not? The Renaissance humanists did reject St. Thomas's scholasticism, but not philosophy. Why? What was wrong with scholasticism in their view? To them, scholasticism was obsessed with sterile, pointless, and meaningless subtleties, and it didn't lead to any useful knowledge or understanding. The sort of thing that later generations would mock, asking, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? But The humanists objected only to the specifics of the scholastic reconciliation, but not to classical philosophy itself, or with the need to reconcile it with Christianity. In their eyes, the two, classical philosophy and Christianity, didn't contradict each other, but rather complemented each other. They were two faces of the same coin, of the same eternal truth, what humanists later called prisca theologia, the single true theology that they believed threads through all ancient religions. For example, the celebrated 14th century poet Petrarch, considered the father of Renaissance humanism, crowned poet laureate in 1342 in Rome, and an outspoken critic of scholasticism, argued that while philosophy taught what virtue consisted of, it didn't encourage the love of virtue. What good is there in knowing what virtue is, he asked, if this knowledge doesn't make us love it? Both Christianity and philosophy were needed. By the way, the term Renaissance didn't exist back then. It was coined by 19th century historians to describe this cultural moment, probably inspired by Petrarch's declaration that his older contemporary Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy represented a rinascita, a rebirth of poetry as good as anything that had been composed in ancient Rome. Renaissance humanists were convinced that classical antiquity, the era before the advent of Christianity, was a time of excellence which their own times needed to emulate in order to repair the damage done by the barbaric centuries that had followed the fall of the Roman Empire, and that scholasticism was one of those barbarities. They believed that what should be taught in universities instead of scholasticism was what they called Studia humanitatis, human studies, classical Latin, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, knowledge that emphasized individual humans and their needs instead of theology. The humanists, who all belonged to the upper classes, the ruling classes, believed that these human studies would be useful in both private and public life, and would, 1, promote virtue by encouraging elites to emulate what the humanists believed were the superior morals and virtues of classical antiquity, 2, educate the elites in the language and rhetorical skills they needed to participate in public life, 3, and equally important, in their eyes at least, promote the use of proper classical Latin in the style of Cicero and other pagan Roman writers, in place of the hopelessly corrupted church Latin they regarded with contempt. It's almost as if they thought that if they revived the Roman Republic's glorious language, they would somehow also revive the glorious Roman Republic. Knowing that so many of the pagan books they so valued had been lost over the centuries, humanists searched the libraries of cathedrals and remote monasteries and shared their discoveries among themselves with great excitement. They carefully read, reread, and copied these books that contained the ancient wisdom they so highly valued. They even invented new letter forms so that their handwriting would be easier to read. In short, many of them dreamed of somehow restoring not only proper Latin, but also the classical era, the era before Christianity. But why did the classical era need to be restored? What was so wrong with Italy in the 1300s? What, aside from the scholasticism they rejected, did Renaissance humanists want to change? What stood at the forefront of their minds was the sad state of their Italy, a once glorious nation that had disintegrated into numerous fiercely competitive city-states, Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, Rome, and others that were constantly fighting, snatching territories from each other in endless little wars, forming and breaking alliances and treaties, as well as being repeatedly invaded by foreigners, the French, the Spanish, the Swiss, and the German so-called Holy Roman Emperor, who, to add insult to injury, also held the title of King of Italy. This is what Italy looked like in the 1300s, and in fact, since the fall of the Roman Empire almost 1,000 years before. Invasions, endless wars, massacres, betrayals, famines, epidemics, including the mid-century Black Death that had killed more than half of the population of the cities. All this punctuated by brief periods of peace, all this somehow along steady economic growth. The city-states didn't have citizen armies of their own, but relied on mercenaries who fought for the highest bidder and often switched sides, sometimes even in the middle of a war if the highest bidder changed. Sometimes the leaders of these mercenary armies would even take over the cities that had hired them. And then there were the papal states, ruled by the Pope. Today we think of the Pope as only a spiritual leader, the ruler of a tiny country smaller than an American shopping mall. But since the fall of the Roman Empire, popes had also been secular rulers of sizable territories of their own. They regularly interfered in the political battles of other Italian city-states. They formed and broke alliances with them. They fought wars against them, and they meddled in the marriages and divorces of their rulers, as well as the kings and queens of the rest of Europe. The popes were in many ways not so very different from the rulers of their rival city-states. Everywhere they looked, Italians could see that on the one hand, Italy was overrun, beaten, despoiled, violated, and humiliated, and on the other, they could see the encyclopedia of antiquity everywhere around them, the ruins of their pagan ancestors, reminders of Italy's glorious past, the Roman Colosseum, the Arch of Constantine, the Arch of Titus, the Pantheon, Roman roads still in use, Roman aqueducts still carrying water, and other reminders of a great empire that had conquered the whole known world, reminders that seemed to silently mock their own meager achievements. Giovanni Dandi, an architect who visited Rome in 1375, and already on the journey out, he had not failed to note the more striking Roman ruins on his way. The enthusiasm of Dandi was, however, to reach its highest peaks in Rome. One may well wonder how much time he dedicated in Rome to the visiting of churches and to pious practices, and how much time to investigating what was left of the pagan city. Not only Italians saw these reminders of Italy's shame. Every Lent, one writer noted around 1450, some 40,000 or 50,000 pilgrims come flocking to Rome and are thrilled to see the old palaces, the amphitheaters, the baths, and the aqueducts, and to learn what they were and what they meant. Set in a firm foundation, then, the glory of Roman majesty still thrives, and in blissful reverence, under no compulsion, and with no clash of arms, much of the world bows its head to Rome. These reminders were not just in Italy, but all over Europe. The Maison Carrée and the amphitheater in Nîmes, and the Pont du Gard aqueduct in France, Diocletian's palace in Split, Hadrian's wall in England, the Basilica of Constantine in Trier, and many, many others. Imagine what the humanists must have felt, knowing how low Italy had fallen, while seeing all around them reminders of its long-lost glory. No wonder they dreamed of somehow restoring the grandeur that was Rome. The poet Petrarch wrote, "My Italy, there's no power in speech to heal the wounds that gape so many and so mortal in your side. Show but a single sign of feeling for their tears, and in its wake, valor against blind rage will take up arms. The battle will be short, for all that ancient bravery has still not died in the Italian heart." In the eyes of many humanists, with the typical nostalgia that remembers only the good but not the bad, not the endless wars of the Romans, nor the overwhelming cruelty, brutality, and depravity of their armies and politicians, in humanists' imagination, the Roman Republic had been the most perfect of all states, and its citizens had enjoyed equally perfect lives. They asked, will the glory of those times ever return? Can the blessings of the Golden Age ever be restored? When in 1347 the upstart Colle d'Arenzio who campaigned for the unification of Italy and the establishment of a new Roman Republic, exactly what the humanists longed for. When he seized power in Rome, Petrarch wrote to him, comparing him to Romulus, the mythical founder of ancient Rome. But after the Pope denounced Cola as a criminal, a pagan, and a heretic, his rule collapsed and he fled Rome, just as Petrarch was on his way there to join him. The Florentine diplomat and historian Niccolò Machiavelli also longed for the days of the idealized Roman Republic. After he had been forced to retire to his farm by the Medici, he wrote to a friend, "When evening comes, I return to my home, and I go into my study, and on the threshold I take off my everyday clothes, which are covered with mud and mire, and put on regal and curial robes, and dressed in a more appropriate manner, I enter into the ancient courts of ancient men, and am welcomed by them kindly. And there I taste the food that alone is mine, and for which I was born, and there I am not ashamed to talk to them, to ask them the reasons for their actions, and they, in their humanity, answer me, and for 4 hours I feel no boredom, I dismiss every affliction, I no longer fear poverty, nor do I tremble at the thought of death. I become completely part of them." Please join me in the next episode, where we'll discuss how a movement confined to a tiny group of bookworms had such an outsized effect on the society around them, and how two developments in 1453, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks and Gutenberg's printing press, accelerated the Renaissance revival of classical learning and its undermining of the cultural, religious, and philosophical foundations of Western society. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up icon, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.